Victoria here. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about my assigned play, A Warning for Fair Women. Before I get into my 3 segments, I want to provide a little bit of background about the play. Essentially, it's a tragedy of lust, gain, deceit, and heartbreak. Throughout the course of the play, we follow the lives of several characters. Now, the story gets a little confusing because 4 of the titular characters' names are George Brown, George Sanders, Anne Sanders, and Anne Drury. So we have 2 Georges and 2 Annes. Last names are very important here. In the most basic sense of good and bad, the Sanders are the innocents, and George Brown and Anne Drury are the bad guys. George and Anne Sanders live a happy marriage and want nothing more. Unfortunately, after just meeting Anne Sanders, George Brown decides he needs to marry her and have sex with her to fulfill his lustful desires, though he calls it love. But in order to marry her, he needs to kill her husband first. Perfectly normal thing to do. To do this, he recruits the help of Anne Sanders' friend Anne Drury and her servant Roger. In the end, he is successful, but a witness who he thought he killed identifies Brown as the murderer of George Sanders. When all is said and done, the manipulators, George Brown, Anne Drury, and Roger, are sentenced to hanging, as well as Anne Sanders. And to top it all off, this is based on the true events of George Sanders' murder in 1500s England. Now that you have some background information, let's dive into it. 3 things I'm going to talk about today are 3 quotes I pulled from the play encapsulating different overall themes, differing opinions on the anonymous author of this story and my opinion on who penned it, and finally, a little bit about the dynamic of some of the characters. This story and the background behind it are both a little complex, so there's a lot to talk about. The first of the 3 quotes I pulled from the script reads as follows: "Soil not your hands with the blood of innocents." This quote is spoken by George Sanders, the number 1 victim of our story in Act 3, Scene 3, line 66 on page 74, just before he takes his final breaths as George Brown attempts to murder him. One of the themes present in A Warning for Fair Women is that dark deeds lead to dark consequences. And this quote truly encapsulates that, as well as the message of morality this play is trying to give. George Brown's dark deeds lead to dark consequences for not only himself, but everyone involved in George Sanders' murder. This is further represented at the end of the first act as the character, Tragedy, literally coats both of George Brown's hands in blood, as well as Anne Drury's and Roger's. Tragedy even dips Anne Sanders' finger in blood. In one way or another, each of these characters had some part to play in the death of George Sanders. The scene with Tragedy and the blood on the hands of the perpetrators comes before the quote, "Soil not your hands with the blood of innocents." In this script, when the character Tragedy enters, she's usually telling and showing us in a dreamlike sequence the events that are about to come. So the physical blood is definitely a bit of foreshadowing, and George Sanders saying this about the blood of innocents, or himself, is that foreshadowing coming to fruition. And like I said, everyone involved in his murder gets hanged at the end of the show, suffering the consequences of their dark deeds. So I definitely find this quote to be influential to the overarching theme of the story, especially given the fact that this was written in the late 1500s, when religion would have had a great impact on England's culture, hence this being a morality play. The second quote I pulled from the script is, "Poverty parts company." This quote is spoken by George Brown, the murderer, in Act 4, Scene 2, on page 89, line 84. Up until this point, Brown has been paying Anne Drury and Roger for their services in spying on George Sanders and manipulating Anne Sanders. By the time Brown says, "Poverty parts company," he's run out of money. I find this quote to be very interesting and still very relevant today. In the context of the play, it encapsulates the feeling that everyone has something to gain from their actions, intentions, and/or alliances. Even though in this circumstance it has to do with money, I think this quote could definitely be applied to other situations. And I feel like it's relevant today because it's very similar to how people will often only do things for others when there's some kind of benefit involved for them. It kind of reminds me of Hans in Frozen. Even though he didn't love Anna, he didn't originally intend on killing her or even Elsa. He even said himself that he had to marry into royalty to ever think about becoming a king as 13th in line behind his brothers. Before things seemingly fell into place for him, he fully intended on marrying Anna, and getting rid of Elsa along the way, but that's another story. He intended to use Anna to get what he wanted, and when she no longer had something to offer him, or he found something better suited to getting what he wanted, he didn't care about what happened to anyone. This almost parallels George Brown's relationship with Anne Drury and Roger when they realized they might be in trouble. Poverty parts company. And it happens far too often. The third quote I pulled from the script is, "Lust, gain, and murder spurred this villain on, still to pursue this unsuspecting soul, and now the dreadful hour of death has come." This quote was spoken by Tragedy in Act 3, Scene 2 on page 71, lines 11 through 13. I feel that this quote emphasizes the religious aspect of the story. Lust and gain were the driving forces behind George Brown's actions. Based on what the other characters said about him, other than the fact that his brother was arrested and also sentenced to death for murder, there was nothing to suggest he had ever done anything malicious before this. In the end, Brown felt guilty for the crimes he committed. He essentially admitted he had been corrupted by these desires, this sin, in a time when religion was a major part of people's values. Especially in the 1500s, it makes sense that religion would be a major part of a morality play such as this. Overall, I fully believe these three quotes emphasize some of the themes present throughout A Warning for Fair Women. Throughout the years, there's been a lot of speculation on who the author of A Warning for Fair Women truly is. Officially speaking, the play was published anonymously, but thanks to some curious scholars, there's a lot of evidence which points to two different possible authors. The first possible author of A Warning for Fair Women is Thomas Heywood. The introduction to the version of the play, which was edited by Gemma Leggett, goes into heavy detail of J.Q. Adams' research of Thomas Heywood. For starters, J.Q. Adams claims that there is much evidence in Heywood's other works, similar to that of A Warning for Fair Women, to suggest he is the true author. He explains how his previous use of language, staging, and characterization would have influenced this play. The timeline checks out, as Heywood would have been in his 20s when and if he wrote the play. This is a stark contrast to the other author I'm going to talk about, who was at the end of his life when this play was published. On page 8 of the introduction, J.Q. Adams says Heywood, quote, "filled up a line with repetition, a stylistic feature which can be seen in a number of his plays as well as this one," unquote. He also notes that these similarities were featured in another one of his plays published not long after this one, called A Woman Killed with Kindness. We can see how these titles are sort of similar. While this is all great information to back up Adams' claim that Thomas Heywood is the author, I personally feel like there's a greater amount of evidence, more clean-cut evidence, that Thomas Kidd is the true author behind this anonymous title. In my assigned artifact for A Warning for Fair Women, which was a different introduction to the play, A.F. Hopkinson talks a lot about not just evidence within the text of the play itself, but also information on what was happening behind the scenes during the time it was written. In my opinion, the behind-the-scenes information is what gives the most merit to his claim. Something I thought about when I read that this work was published in 1599 was that it must have been written before that, if that was just when it was published. I wasn't sure how much earlier, but Hopkinson definitely puts it into perspective. Hopkinson believed that A Warning for Fair Women was written around 1589 to 1590, roughly 9 to 10 years before it was published. Part of his reasoning for this is the difference in the times the Exchange was open. The Exchange was where George Sanders worked in the play, and it's also a real place in England. In the introduction, Hopkinson notes that the business hour for the Exchange is from 10 to 11 o'clock, according to the script. He provides a bit of evidence that stacks against this play being written around 1598, as he references the hours of another play, Englishman for My Money, written the same year. Englishman for My Money, quote, attended the exchange at 11 o'clock and dined at 12 o'clock, unquote. It's all a little confusing, I know, but just know the hours written in the script contradict the real-life hours of the time and don't align with the publication date. Hopkinson also argues that the most commonly known first performance of A Warning for Fair Women, performed by the Lord Chamberlain's Men, was simply a revival of the show, and that the Pembroke's Men gave the first true public performance at the Curtain Theatre between 1589 and 1590. This isn't too uncommon to revivals we see today, like The Music Man currently on Broadway with Hugh Jackman and Sutton Foster. It's not the first showing or the first presentation of the musical, it's just the one we have currently. The original was written in the Golden Age and performed in the Golden Age, so that's kind of similar to what's happening here. He bases this on an obscure stage direction in the play's script, which lists a character named M. Humphrey. I have to admit, there are a lot of characters in this play, especially minor ones, but nowhere in it is there a character by that name. It's very odd that this would be written in with no relevance whatsoever. Hopkinson further explains that a man named Humphrey Jeffs was one of the Pembroke's Men's players, and that there's nothing to suggest he was ever connected to the Lord Chamberlain's Men. I personally think this connection is very telling. Not only the fact that this name, written in the script, appeared within the Pembroke's Men's company, but also the timeline adds up. Based on his writings, Hopkinson has done years of research on this topic, and he was so determined to place a name with the play, and that name is Thomas Kyd. Throughout his writing, Hopkinson makes a lot of connections between Thomas Kyd, the timeline of events, and A Warning for Fair Women. First of all, the fact that Thomas Kyd published all of his plays under the title of Anonymous doesn't exactly make it unrealistic that he would publish this one any differently. Hopkinson also writes a lot about how Thomas Kyd's writing style is eerily similar to that of A Warning for Fair Women, specifically in the Spanish tragedy. Now, I have not personally read the Spanish tragedy, but he explains how it has a strong use of a chorus, and how it was used at the beginning of each act. This almost parallels A Warning for Fair Women. At the beginning of each act, the character tragedy, symbolizing the genre of the story, acts as a chorus, explaining what's about to happen. Rather than using a full chorus, she uses individual people to represent ideas such as lust, chastity, and mercy. Throughout the show, they perform dance-like sequences, which act as metaphors. It's very reminiscent of a Greek chorus, just with less people. Hopkinson also describes a little bit about how Thomas Kyd always believed in justice, especially relating to murder. Justice is a major theme within A Warning for Fair Women, and it's even the name of one of the characters in Scenes with Tragedy. These are all just a few points that Hopkinson makes in his defense of the anonymous author. When I was first reading through everything, I wholeheartedly thought, yeah, I could see how Thomas Heywood could be the author. And then when I read all this research about Thomas Kyd, I immediately changed my mind. There's just so much evidence that points to him being the author. There are parts of this play which are also very poetic, and I could sort of see how the author might strive for a story where justice prevails if he was nearing the end of his life. Personally, I now lean a lot more towards the side of Thomas Kyd being the author. There really is not a ton of information out there about this show, so it's crazy to me how much digging A.F. Hopkinson would have had to do, and he spent years doing it. At least until I get more information, I'm on the side of Thomas Kyd being the author rather than Thomas Heywood. I know it's been a lot of information, but I'm curious to know what you, our dedicated listeners, think. Be sure to let me know. Now, I've spoken a little bit about the structure of the show and the character tragedy, and I want to dive into that a little bit further. The play opens with the characters' comedy, history, and tragedy bickering and literally telling the audience that they are about to see a tragedy. I honestly love how this opens the show because it's a nice bit of lighthearted banter before things get crazy and confusing. There's a lot of symbolism going on here too, which is really interesting. They each have strong and starkly different personalities, and each hold a physical item relating to their themes and styles. Tragedy enters holding a knife in one hand and a whip in the other, almost as if she's gonna get history and comedy whipped into shape. Thanks for entertaining my Legally Blonde the Musical reference, all two of you who understood it. Moving on. History enters playing a drum, symbolizing the beat of time. And I thought this was a really great choice for history because it could be elaborated on so much in a production. The speed and intensity could symbolize how life has moments of peacefulness, but also moments of rage, sadness, and craziness in general. The music nerd in me just has so many visions with this aspect. And while it's not scripted, it's also something that could definitely come back later in the scenes with tragedy, almost as if the speed and intensity could symbolize the events of A Warning for Fair Women. In addition to tragedy with her knife and whip, and history with his drum, comedy enters playing a fiddle. This really made me want to laugh, especially at how much it bothered tragedy, because I could definitely see comedy as like a kind of jester that we might see from The Hunchback of Notre Dame or something like that. I could totally see comedy just like dancing a jig and playing the fiddle comedically. And that's not to say it wouldn't be played well, just that I think the higher pitched sound we get from a fiddle is so different from the low beat of a drum, and that's a really nice contrast. Each of these characters is very different, and I think their specific props and the use of their props, along with their dialogue, helps to establish who they are and gives the audience a nice visual. I also just really love this first scene. It's the only scene comedy and history are in, and yet it feels so impactful, especially for the time it was written. Comedy and history make a reference to the way theaters used to alternate what days they would show more lighthearted shows versus deeper, more intense tragedies. They basically say, yeah, tragedy, the audience might enjoy your story today, but they'll be back the next day for hours. And I just think it's so funny. It's a really nice calm before the storm. If this production was put on today, I think that might be one of the things that might be slightly outdated to a modern audience without knowledge of theater history. Because now people pretty much just watch whatever they want, whenever they want, of whatever genre they want. But it's still such a nice touch, and I love this interaction. All of the characters in A Warning for Fair Women are very well written, but I find these to be particularly interesting. Tragedy is a nice substitute for the traditional chorus as the story progresses, along with other characters like justice, mercy, lust, and chastity. So, now you know a lot more about some of the themes throughout the play, the playwright, and some of the characters. I really enjoyed researching this play, a lot more than I thought I would. I got a little bit nervous when I saw how early it was written, but I was so invested in the story once I got the hang of reading it that I really didn't mind. If you haven't read it, it's one I would definitely recommend, especially if you're wanting to fulfill your desire for a great tragedy, or dare I say thriller. It's definitely an early example of true crime, and that was something that I think I really enjoyed. The fact that it was based on a true story, and that it was so well adapted to the stage. There's so much more to talk about. We really only scraped the surface with all this information. If you have any questions, please be sure to let me know. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. This is Victoria, signing off.